Hello and welcome to another chapter in our tutorial series. In this chapter, I am speaking about browser developer tools. Now, in the previous video, I mentioned that when you think about programming, for example, languages such as C Sharp, or let's say if you're building a Android mobile app, you can use something like Android Studio. For C Sharp and .NET, you would use something like um, Visual Studio. Now, don't get confused with Visual Studio and Visual Studio Code. Now, they are two separate things. So I'm talking about Visual Studio. An easy way to find out is Visual Studio has a purple logo, whereas Visual Studio Code is blue in color. So something to remember. So yeah, so now these things like Visual Studio and Android Studio, or I think there is something called JetBrains IDE for Java and so on. So these things, they are called integrated development environment. So that means these things, or if you're old school, there are also things like Turbo C in the olden days that we used to use in college way back when I was a college student. So these are integrated development environments. So like the title suggests, you simply need to use these IDEs to do all your development work. However, for web development, which is what we are trying to do, where we are using a combination of HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, and some related frameworks which are built on top of these things, there is no IDE as such. So that is where we have to use multiple tools to do your web development activities. So that is where browser developer tools become so important. So let me go ahead and show you some browser developer tools that we'll be using in this course, and you'll be using them throughout your work as a web developer, whether it is front end or back end and so on. So so there we go. So the first thing you want to understand is that in this course and in all our workshops and boot camps, and as a personal choice for me, I will be using the Firefox browser for all coding activities. I like Firefox primarily because, like today we have many brands of browsers, like just like how you have different brands of cars and computers and so on. There are different companies which provide browser software. You have Firefox. You also obviously you have, I mentioned that there as alternatives. You have Chrome. You have Edge. Chrome is from Google. Edge is from Microsoft. You have Opera browser from Opera company. I think Opera browser is called Opera company. Yeah. So like this, there are many brands. Now, I personally like Firefox because one, Firefox is from Mozilla company, which I think is a non-profit. So I just have a little bit of a personal preference for open source products. So that's probably the main reason why I like Firefox. So that is what I will be using. But if you want to, you can use other browsers like Chrome, Edge, Opera, and so on. The tools that I mentioned and everything that we are teaching will work in those browsers as well. However, as this course is primarily meant for first-time programmers, I would request or insist that you use Firefox as well, just to maintain some consistency between what is being shown on the screen in our videos and also what you'll be practicing on your own computer. So yes, please use Firefox if possible, but I'm not stopping you from using other browsers. Now, because as I mentioned, there is no conventional IDE that is available for web development. Okay, like for example, I mentioned Android Studio and Visual Studio. Once again, Visual Studio is separate from Visual Studio Code, which is an editor that we are using for our web development activities. So let's go ahead and see what are the things I'll show you, but before I show you, I'll just explain some general terms. So mainly you'll be using on a daily basis, you'll be using what is called as an inspector. I'll show you what the inspector is in a minute. And of course, you'll be using the console window. That's another tab that is available in browsers, developer tools. And of course, sometimes you'll be even checking the network tab for network activities and performance and stuff like that. And there are a lot of other tabs as well, which you'll become familiar as your web development journey continues. But primarily inspect and I get the developer tools. Now, the first thing I mentioned is the inspector. In the PowerPoint, I showed that the main things are inspector. The next thing is console log, and the next thing is the network tab, and there are others. Let's look at them one by one here. The first thing is the inspector. The inspector is useful to see different components of your code. You'll see here as I move through different DOM elements, DOM elements are components in your HTML. So as I move the mouse through different components, the corresponding DOM element gets highlighted. You can see here again. So I selected the image is getting selected. I selected this paragraph, the paragraph is getting selected. I selected this div, that div is getting selected. I selected this button, the button is getting selected. So like this. So this is what an inspector does. It allows you to inspect, and there are a lot of additional properties you can see here. So as I change things, you'll notice in the bottom more and more things are changing. We'll go a little bit detail in future chapters, but right now I'm just showing you what the main tabs, developer tools that you will be using. So that's about the inspector. Now the inspector also has a mouse option where you can directly select something. Look at this. As you move through the DOM elements, the corresponding items will get automatically selected on the right side. So if I select this, that gets selected on the right side. So this is what I'm talking about. So inspector is actually two things. You can select it directly on your web page, or you can select it here in the code section. And as you check different things, the styling and other options become available, which has even more tabs for you to check it out. So it's a lot. Right now it might feel like all of this is a lot, but after a few hours or few days or weeks of coding, you'll find that you'll become very familiar with these things, and they will no longer feel strange or something like that. So that is the main thing, which is the inspector. So again, the inspector is about inspecting your HTML and CSS code. You can make changes and things like that. We'll go deeper into it in future chapters once we start showing you some HTML and CSS code. So let's resume. Once again, I'm going to hide myself so you can look at the entire thing so I don't block anything. So let's do that. Next thing is the console tab. The console tab is mainly for looking at what is called as console messages. Okay, so these are messages that developers use, especially when they are learning to keep an eye on what's happening. It is called as console messages. Yeah, that's what they're called. I also like to use the word called caveman debugging. That's what they call it. We'll talk about that in future episodes. So for example, you can see here now what happens is on the left side, there is a button. Now keep an eye on the right side. Right now there are no messages, no console messages. And then I click on this button and immediately you can see a lot of things are happening and a lot of stuff is getting written. A lot of messages are coming up. Okay, so that is what I'm talking about. So you can see here on the left side, whatever is happening. On the right side, it is being tracked. It's called logging, like how a ship log or a captain's log or something like that. It's almost like a journal or something. So whatever is happening in your project, especially in JavaScript, it is possible for you to go ahead and log those things. So let me show that again. So let me just reload this. There you go. Again, everything is reset. It's all gone. And then I'm going to click on this. Right now, there's only one message. I like Batman, so I just put there a message called "I am Batman." Now let me click on this button. Keep an eye on the right side. Look at that. So they're all console messages giving you an idea about what is happening. Now, in my experience for newcomers, this is called caveman debugging. I really think, even though this takes a little bit of extra time to do all this, a little bit of extra effort on your part, as a tutor, as a guy who's been teaching for more than 10 years, K-man debugging is something which really, really can make a big difference when you're learning. It does slow down the learning speed because you have to sit and type the extra code to make the logging work. To make the caveman debugging work, you have to write extra code, of course, but it is totally worth it. And I really request you, it is optional. I remember I was talking about this in another video, like CodePen, you don't have to use it. That is like an extra step. Every extra step is an extra effort, extra amount of time that you have to spend. It is optional. But I always tell my students, and I mostly teach first time developers, that yes, using CodePen can really make the overall quality of learning better, if a little bit slower. Still, it's okay. It will improve the quality of your learning experience. So similarly, console logging is optional. I know a lot of developers who don't write a single console log message and still get the work done. But I recommend, as you are a first time learner, use console logging as much as possible, and I will be using it. I'll be using it throughout the course, and even when I work on a project and stuff like that. I even today, despite more than I don't know, 18 years of programming experience, even today I diligently write console logs. So it's very, very useful. So that is the console tab. Let me move on to the next one. There's also a debugger tab, which is useful when you're doing some debugging with JavaScript. So again, we'll go into details about this later. And then there's also the network tab I told you about, where you can check what's happening and stuff like that. Very useful when, again, when something goes wrong or you want to keep track. Usually all these things that you have to understand, these browser developer tools, ultimately the whole point of browser developer tools is to help you when something doesn't work as expected. Like right now, this project, obviously for the sake of this course, everything we need, we've already built the code, and only after everything was ready we started recording these videos. So but while these things were being built, I would have run into hundreds of problems. The button might not work, the data is not coming, all kind of issues. So you may have heard of this word debugging. Something goes wrong, there's a bug which needs fixing. So when you're trying to fix bugs, the developer tools are what is going to help you. As the title says, developer tools. These are tools available to help you, the developer, fix problems. So there you go, folks. That is all about browser developer tools, and this is where I'm going to end this specific chapter.